February 1943. The North Atlantic Ocean crashed against the steel hull of the transport ship as it carried hundreds of German prisoners toward an unknown destination. Wehrmacht Corporal Hans Müller sat in the dark cargo hold with 347 other captured soldiers, their hands bound, their uniforms still caked with sand from the North African desert, where Allied forces had defeated them weeks earlier. The air smelled of salt water, diesel fuel, and unwashed bodies. Hans was 24 years old and had never expected to become a prisoner. He expected to die fighting. Back home in Germany, the war consumed everything. By early 1943, the Nazi regime had mobilized the entire nation for total war. Every factory produced weapons or supplies for the military. Every farm sent its food to soldiers at the front. German civilians received ration cards that provided only 2,400 calories each day, barely enough to survive. Meat appeared once or twice weekly if families were lucky. Real coffee had vanished years ago, replaced by roasted grain that tasted like burnt dirt. Butter was a distant memory. Women stood in line for hours hoping to buy bread made with sawdust mixed into the flour to make it stretch further. The Nazi propaganda filled every radio broadcast and newspaper. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels spoke constantly about the weakness of democracy, the cruelty of Britain, and the cowardice of America. German soldiers received clear messages during training. Capture meant torture. The British would starve you. The Americans would beat you. The Canadians, being British subjects, would be just as brutal. Better to die fighting than surrender, the officers said. Better to take your own life than fall into enemy hands where unspeakable horrors awaited. Hans had believed these warnings. Every German soldier believed them. They had no reason to doubt. The Reich controlled all information. No contradicting voices existed. No alternative perspectives filtered through. The government told them democracy made nations soft and weak, that free people could not match the strength and discipline of the Third Reich. They said the Allies fought without honour, without mercy, without basic human decency. So, when the transport ship finally docked and guards marched the prisoners off onto Canadian soil, Hans braced himself for violence. He expected beatings. He expected starvation rations. He expected to be worked to death in some frozen labour camp. Instead, military trucks with working heaters drove them 2 hours north to a place called Bowmanville, Ontario. The trucks had cushioned seats. The guards did not strike anyone. They did not even yell very much. Camp 30 sat surrounded by farmland and forests, far from any major city. High fences topped with barbed wire enclosed several long wooden barracks painted white. Guard towers stood at each corner, soldiers watching with rifles ready. But as the prisoners filed through the gates, Hans noticed something strange. The buildings looked solid and new. Smoke rose from chimneys, meaning the barracks had heat. Through windows he glimpsed bunk beds with mattresses, not just wooden boards or concrete floors. The Canadian officer in charge, a captain with a thick moustache, addressed them through a German-speaking interpreter. His words shocked every prisoner standing in formation. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," the interpreter translated. "You will receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care. You will not be harmed if you follow camp rules. You will be allowed to write letters home. You will receive Red Cross packages. Welcome to Canada." Welcome? Hans exchanged confused glances with Klaus, a Panzer tank crewman from Munich who had been captured alongside him. What kind of prison camp welcomed its prisoners? Guards assigned them to barracks. Each building held 60 men. Inside, Hans found rows of bunk beds with real mattresses stuffed with straw. Wool blankets lay folded on each bed, 2 per person. The barracks had a wood stove in the centre, already burning, keeping the space warm despite the February cold outside. Windows had actual glass, not just boards or bars. The wooden floors looked clean and swept. Then came dinner. Guards led groups of prisoners to a large mess hall building. Inside, long tables and benches filled the space. The kitchen staff, a mix of Canadian soldiers and German prisoners who had arrived earlier, served food on metal trays. Hans stared at his tray in disbelief. Beef stew with actual chunks of meat floating among potatoes and carrots. 2 thick slices of white bread. Real butter, not margarine. A cup of coffee that smelled genuine, not the fake grain substitute he had drunk for 3 years. Klaus sat beside him, holding his spoon but not eating, just staring. "This is a trick," he whispered. "They fatten us up before something terrible happens." But Hans was too hungry to care. He ate every bite. The stew tasted rich and filling. The bread was soft and fresh. The butter melted on his tongue like a forgotten dream. He could not remember the last time he'd eaten so well. Not since before the war started, certainly. Maybe not even then, since his family had never been wealthy. Around him, 300 other German prisoners ate in silence, their faces showing the same confusion and disbelief. Some men cried quietly as they chewed, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. Others ate mechanically, unable to process what was happening. A few refused to eat at all, convinced the food was poisoned or drugged. That night, lying on his bunk under 2 warm blankets, listening to the wood stove crackle, Hans could not sleep. His mind spun with questions. Why did the Canadians treat captured enemies so well? Where did all this food come from during wartime? How could they afford such generosity? Everything he had been taught about the weak, dying democracies contradicted what he experienced in his first 12 hours as a prisoner. On the 3rd morning, a moment arrived that would define Hans's entire captivity. A Canadian Guard captain walked into the recreation yard carrying an armload of ice skates and wooden hockey sticks. The equipment looked worn but functional, the leather skates cracked from use, the sticks taped at the handles. Behind him, 2 more guards dragged a wooden box filled with pucks and extra gear. The captain set everything down near the frozen pond at the edge of the campgrounds and looked at the gathered German prisoners. "Any of you Germans know how to skate?" he asked. The interpreter translated his words into German. The prisoners stared in stunned silence. Hans thought he must have misheard. Ice skating? Hockey? In a prison camp? During a war? Several prisoners raised their hands slowly, unsure if this was some kind of test or trap. Hans raised his too. He had grown up near a lake in Bavaria and had skated every winter as a boy. The captain smiled and nodded. "Good," the interpreter translated. "We play hockey here on Thursday afternoons. You're welcome to join us, guards and prisoners together. It helps pass the time." Klaus grabbed Hans's arm and whispered urgently, "This cannot be real. What prison camp plays games with prisoners? What guards befriend the enemy?" But it was real. That Thursday, Hans laced up a pair of borrowed skates and stepped onto the ice for the first time in 5 years. The frozen pond stretched about 30 meters across, surrounded by snow-covered trees. Other prisoners joined him, some wobbling on uncertain legs, others gliding smoothly. Canadian guards skated out too, dividing into teams. A young corporal with red hair passed the puck to Hans. "You're on my team," he said through gestures and broken German. "Let's beat these guys." For 2 hours they played. Wehrmacht soldiers and Royal Canadian Artillery Guards chasing a rubber puck across the ice, shouting and laughing when someone fell, cheering when someone scored. A German U-boat officer who had served in the Atlantic deked past a Canadian sergeant and slapped the puck into the makeshift goal. The sergeant laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. Hans scored once himself, a sloppy shot that somehow slipped past the goalie. His teammates, both German and Canadian, mobbed him in celebration. When the game ended, Hans sat on a bench removing his skates, breathing hard, his cheeks flushed from exercise and cold air. He felt more alive than he had in months, more human. The Canadian corporal sat beside him, unlacing his own skates. "Good game," the guard said in English, giving a thumbs up. Hans nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight with emotions he could not name. The hockey games became a regular event every Thursday, but they were just one of countless shocks that continued to pile up week after week. The camp held 645 German prisoners by March, and the food kept arriving in impossible quantities. Hans watched supply trucks roll through the gates every Monday and Friday, loaded with sacks of flour, crates of canned vegetables, boxes of fresh potatoes, and sides of beef hanging from hooks. The kitchen, which was run entirely by German prisoners under loose Canadian supervision, operated with an efficiency that Germany itself had not seen since before the war started. Hans volunteered to work in the kitchen during his second week, curious to see exactly how much food the camp received. The numbers stunned him. Each prisoner received approximately 3,200 calories per day. 3,200. German soldiers fighting at the front received about 3,000. Civilians back home received only 2,400, and that was on paper. In reality, rations often ran short and people made do with less. Breakfast at Camp 30 included porridge with real milk, scrambled eggs twice a week, toast with butter or jam, and coffee or tea. Lunch brought soup with bread and sometimes cheese. Dinner featured meat 4 times every week, beef or pork or chicken, accompanied by potatoes or rice, vegetables from cans or root cellars, and occasionally dessert. Actual dessert. Cake or pudding or canned fruit. Hans gained weight quickly. His sunken cheeks filled out. His ribs, which had shown clearly through his skin after months in North Africa, disappeared under healthy flesh. He was not alone. A Red Cross inspection in June documented that German prisoners at Camp 30 had gained an average of 14 pounds within their first 6 months of captivity. 14 pounds. While Germany starved. The abundance extended beyond food. The camp library held 2,300 books in German, everything from novels to technical manuals. Prisoners could check out books freely, 3 at a time. Educational courses began in April. A former university professor among the prisoners taught engineering classes, another taught English. A third organised agricultural training for prisoners who wanted to learn farming techniques. Canadian authorities provided textbooks and supplies. Prisoners who showed interest in trades received tools and materials. A carpentry workshop opened in one of the smaller buildings, equipped with saws, hammers, planes, and fresh lumber. A German cabinet maker who had been captured in Italy taught others his craft. They built furniture for the camp and for themselves. They carved small items to trade or keep as mementos. The guards did not confiscate their work, they encouraged it. The camp infirmary shocked Hans most of all. He went there in May with a bad cold that settled in his chest. A Canadian military doctor examined him thoroughly, listening to his lungs with a stethoscope, taking his temperature, checking his throat. The doctor prescribed sulphur drugs, new medicine that Hans had only heard about in rumours. The medicine worked. His infection cleared in 4 days. The infirmary had X-ray equipment, surgical tools, bandages, antiseptics, and a full stock of medications. The doctor treated German prisoners exactly the same as he would treat Canadian or British soldiers. Hans began keeping a secret diary, writing on scraps of paper he hid under his mattress. He documented everything. The food quantities, the kindness, the medical care, the hockey games, the books, the workshops. He wrote about his growing confusion and the questions that plagued him every night. If Canada could afford to feed prisoners 3,000 calories daily, how much did Canadian citizens eat? If they had medicine and equipment to spare for enemies, how well equipped were their own hospitals? If they allowed prisoners to play hockey and learn trades and read books, how free were their own people? The propaganda had taught him that democracies were weak and dying, collapsing under their own corruption and lack of discipline. But everything Hans saw suggested the opposite. This was not weakness. This was strength so overwhelming that Canada could afford generosity even during wartime. This was wealth so vast that feeding prisoners well barely made a dent in their resources. This was confidence so deep that guards could play hockey with enemy soldiers without fear. Christmas Eve 1943 arrived with heavy snow falling across Camp 30. Hans woke before dawn to the sound of wind howling around the barracks and the familiar crackle of the wood stove keeping the building warm. He had been a prisoner for 10 months now. 10 months that had slowly, steadily dismantled everything he thought he knew about the world, about his enemies, about his own country. But he still clung to fragments of his old beliefs, still told himself that somehow the propaganda contained grains of truth, that Germany was fighting for something righteous even if the methods were harsh. Christmas would shatter those final fragments completely. 2 weeks earlier, the camp commander, a Canadian major with grey hair and a kind face, had made an announcement through the interpreters. The prisoners would be allowed to celebrate Christmas properly. They could decorate the mess hall. They could organise entertainment. They could hold religious services, and the kitchen would prepare a special feast using extra rations approved by the Canadian government specifically for the holiday. The prisoners barely believed it. Klaus approached Hans that evening with tears in his eyes. "They celebrate the birth of Christ with us," he said. "We who bombed their cities and killed their brothers. What kind of people are these?" Hans had no answer, but he joined the preparations eagerly, desperate for something to distract him from the constant churning thoughts that kept him awake at night. A group of prisoners asked the guards for permission to cut pine trees from the forest beyond the fences. The guards agreed and even provided saws and axes. 20 prisoners marched into the woods under light guard, selected several small trees, and brought them back to camp. They decorated the trees with ornaments made from scraps, paper stars painted with watercolours, and strings of popcorn provided by the kitchen. Other prisoners built a small stage in the mess hall for performances. A former opera singer from Berlin organised a choir. They practised German Christmas carols every evening, their voices echoing through the cold December air. A group of artists painted winter scenes on large sheets of paper and hung them on the walls. Someone found red fabric and fashioned it into a crude Santa Claus costume. The mess hall transformed from a plain military dining area into something magical and warm and hopeful. Christmas Eve arrived. The prisoners gathered in the mess hall at 5 in the evening as darkness fell outside and snow continued to pile up against the windows. The pine trees stood in corners, their branches decorated with handmade ornaments that caught the light from oil lamps hanging from the rafters. The smell of pine and wood smoke and cooking food filled the air. Hans sat at a long table with Klaus and several others from their barracks. Canadian guards stood along the walls, but they were not watching with suspicion or hostility. They were simply present, respectful, some even smiling slightly. The choir performed first, 30 German prisoners standing on the small stage singing Stille Nacht in 4-part harmony. Their voices rose pure and clear, filling the hall with a beauty that made Hans's chest ache. He thought of his mother and father back in Bavaria. Were they still alive? Had the Allied bombing raids reached his hometown? Were they huddled in a freezing basement right now, eating turnip soup if they were lucky, listening to air raid sirens wail? Then came the feast. Kitchen workers brought out platters and bowls piled high with food that seemed impossible even after 10 months of abundance. Roasted turkey, golden brown and steaming, baked ham glazed with something sweet, mountains of mashed potatoes with rich gravy, carrots and green beans and beets, fresh baked bread rolls with real butter, and then, incredibly, dessert, apple pie, pumpkin pie, chocolate cake, real chocolate, not the ersatz substitute made from grain that Germans had choked down for years. Hans stared at his plate, unable to move, unable to think. The plate held more food than his entire family would see in a week back home, more food than a German soldier would receive in 3 days at the front. And this was given freely to prisoners, to enemies, to men who had tried to kill Canadian soldiers and British soldiers and American soldiers. Klaus sat beside him, fork in hand, not eating, just staring. "How?" he whispered. "How can they have so much? How can they afford this?" Around them, other prisoners were weeping openly as they ate. Some prayed quietly, thanking God for the meal. Others ate in silence, their faces showing a mixture of gratitude and shame and confusion. A few could not eat at all, too overwhelmed by the contrast between this moment and their memories of home. A Canadian guard sergeant stood nearby, a young man, perhaps 25 years old, watching the prisoners with an expression of quiet satisfaction. Hans caught his eye. The sergeant nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, of shared humanity across the divide of war. In that moment, something inside Hans broke apart completely. He understood with sudden, crushing clarity that the propaganda had been completely backwards. Germany was not fighting weak, dying democracies. Germany was fighting a civilization so strong, so wealthy, so confident in its own power that it could afford to treat its enemies with kindness. A nation that fed prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers was not losing the war. That nation had already won, even if the shooting continued for years. The outcome was inevitable because the foundations were so vastly different. Democracy had not made Canada weak, it had made Canada rich. Free people working for themselves, keeping the fruits of their own labour, choosing their own paths, had created abundance beyond anything Hans had imagined possible. Meanwhile, the Third Reich, with all its talk of strength and discipline and sacrifice, had created only scarcity and suffering and lies. After dinner, Hans walked outside into the falling snow. He needed air. He needed space to think. A guard followed at a distance but did not stop him. Hans stood in the yard looking up at the dark sky, snowflakes landing on his face and melting. He thought about the hockey games, the library books, the medical care, the carpentry workshop, the educational classes. He thought about gaining 14 pounds while his countrymen starved. He thought about guards who played sports with prisoners instead of beating them. That night he returned to his bunk and pulled out his hidden scraps of paper. By the dim light of a small candle, he wrote words that would have gotten him executed if German authorities ever read them. They treat us like humans because they have so much they can afford humanity. We were told democracy made nations soft. Instead, it made them wealthy and confident enough to play hockey with men who tried to kill their brothers. This is not weakness. This is power we never understood. This is strength we cannot match. He wrote about the Christmas feast and what it meant. My family eats turnips if they are lucky. German soldiers at the front receive black bread and thin soup. Meanwhile, Canada roasts turkeys for German prisoners and serves us chocolate cake. This is not generosity born of foolishness. This is generosity born of such overwhelming strength that they do not fear us at all. They pity us, and they are right to pity us because we never had a chance. We were always going to lose this war because you cannot defeat a nation that has so much it can give away abundance and still have plenty left. Klaus found him writing and sat on the edge of the bunk. You see it too now, he said quietly, what this all means. Hans nodded. We fought for the wrong side. Or perhaps there was no right side for us. But we definitely fought for the losing side, and not just because of tanks or planes. We lost because our whole system was built on lies and scarcity, while theirs was built on truth and abundance. They sat together in silence as snow fell outside and other prisoners slept around them, full of turkey and pie, warm under wool blankets in a prison camp that treated them better than their own nation ever had. May 1946. The war had been over for a year. Hans stood on the deck of a repatriation transport ship as it approached the German coast, watching the shoreline emerge through morning fog. 3 years had passed since his capture in North Africa. 3 years spent in Camp 30, playing hockey with Canadian guards, gaining weight on abundant food, reading books in a warm library, learning carpentry in a well-equipped workshop. 3 years that had completely transformed how he understood the world and his place in it. The other prisoners crowded around him at the rail, all of them silent as they stared at their homeland. Most had not received mail from their families in over a year. Communication had broken down as Germany collapsed in the final months of the war. They did not know what they would find. They did not know who had survived. The ship docked at Cuxhaven. Hans walked down the gangway carrying a small canvas bag that held everything he owned. His old Wehrmacht uniform, cleaned and mended. A few books from the camp library that the Canadians had let him keep. Some letters from his parents, the last ones that had gotten through in 1944. A small wooden box he had made in the carpentry workshop, and a worn hockey puck given to him by the red-haired Canadian corporal on his last day at Camp 30. The corporal had pressed the puck into Hans's hand and said through an interpreter, "Remember that enemies can become friends. Remember that kindness is not weakness. Remember what you learned here." Hans had thanked him with tears in his eyes, unable to speak, and tucked the puck carefully into his bag. It was the most valuable thing he owned. Nothing prepared him for what he saw when he stepped onto German soil. Cuxhaven lay in ruins. Buildings stood as hollow shells, their walls cracked and crumbling, their windows empty holes. Rubble filled the streets. Military personnel directed groups of German prisoners of war toward processing centres. Civilians moved through the wreckage like ghosts, their faces hollow and grey, their clothes hanging loose on starving bodies. Hans walked through the town in shock. This was worse than he had imagined, worse than the stories other prisoners had whispered about Allied bombing campaigns. Every block showed destruction. Every face showed suffering. Children sat in doorways with vacant eyes, their bellies swollen from hunger. Old women picked through rubble looking for anything useful, anything salvageable. The smell of smoke and rot hung in the air. At the processing centre, a tired Allied officer checked his papers and gave him travel documents for the train to Bavaria. "Food situation is bad," the officer said in broken German. "Current rations are about 1,200 calories per day. Black market if you have money or goods to trade. Good luck." 1,200 calories. Half of what German civilians received during the war, and less than half of what Hans had been eating in Camp 30. He had gained 30 pounds during his captivity. Now he was returning to a country where people were starving, where children begged for scraps, where the infrastructure had been bombed into rubble. The train journey took 3 days because so many rail lines had been destroyed. The train stopped frequently for track repairs or to wait for clearance through damaged sections. Hans shared a cramped car with 40 other returning prisoners and civilians. Nobody talked much. They just stared out the windows at the passing devastation. Cities reduced to ruins, bridges blown apart, factories destroyed, farmland scarred with bomb craters. When Hans finally reached his hometown in Bavaria, he almost did not recognize it. The train station where he had departed as a young soldier in 1941 was now just a pile of twisted metal and broken concrete. The main street where he had walked to school as a boy was lined with destroyed buildings. The church where his family had attended services every Sunday stood roofless, its walls blackened by fire. He walked through the ruins toward his family's neighborhood, his heart pounding, terrified of what he might find. Many houses on his street were gone completely, just empty lots filled with rubble. But his family's building still stood, damaged but standing. The upper floors had been destroyed by bombing, but the ground floor remained intact. Hans knocked on the door, barely breathing. After a long moment it opened. His mother stood there, thinner than he remembered, her hair completely white now, though she was only 52 years old. She stared at him for several seconds as if she could not believe her eyes. Then she cried out and pulled him into her arms, sobbing against his chest. His father appeared behind her, leaning heavily on a cane, his face gaunt and aged. They pulled Hans inside to what remained of their home. The family now lived entirely in 3 rooms on the ground floor. The furniture was mostly gone, burned for heat during the terrible winter of 1945. They had a small stove, a table, 2 chairs, and mattresses on the floor. The windows were covered with boards because there was no glass available to repair them. They sat together and talked for hours. His parents told him about the bombing raids, the shortages, the deaths of neighbours and friends. His younger sister had died of illness in 1944, weakened by malnutrition. His mother wept as she told him. His father had been injured when a building collapsed during an air raid. Many people in the town had starved during the final winter of the war when food supplies completely failed. Hans listened with growing horror and guilt. While his sister died of hunger, he had been eating turkey and chocolate cake. While his father was injured in bombing raids, he had been playing hockey on a frozen pond. While his mother had burned furniture to stay warm, he had slept under 2 wool blankets in a heated barracks. He tried to explain what he had experienced in Canada, but the words felt wrong in his mouth. How could he tell them about the abundance, the kindness, the ease of his captivity when they had suffered so much? His mother noticed he looked healthy and well-fed. She touched his face with trembling fingers. "They treated you well," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Hans whispered. "Better than I deserved. Better than we treated our own people." His father understood immediately. The old man had fought in the First War and knew about suffering and defeat. "Tell me everything," he said. So Hans did. He told them about the food quantities, the medical care, the library, the workshops, the Christmas feast, the hockey games. He told them about gaining 30 pounds while Germany starved. He told them about the Canadian guards who treated prisoners like human beings instead of animals. When he finished, his father sat in silence for a long time. Then the old man wept, not from sadness but from a deeper understanding. "We fought the wrong way," his father said finally. "We followed the wrong leaders. We believed the wrong ideas. And look what it cost us. Look what we lost." Hans pulled the hockey puck from his bag and set it on the table. His parents stared at it, this strange rubber disc that meant nothing to them but everything to him. "A guard gave this to me when I left," Hans explained. "He said to remember that enemies can become friends, that kindness is not weakness." Over the following months and years, Hans worked to help rebuild his town. He used the carpentry skills he had learned at Camp 30 to repair damaged buildings. He taught others what he knew. He never hid his experience as a prisoner. When people asked, he told them the truth about how well he had been treated, how much food he had received, how the Canadians had shown him more kindness than his own government ever had. In 1948, he became a teacher at the reopened school. He kept the hockey puck on his desk for the next 40 years. Students always asked about it. this strange object in a country where almost nobody played ice hockey. Hans would pick it up, feel its weight in his hand, and tell them the story. He told them about Camp 30 and the guards who played sports with prisoners. He told them about democracy and abundance and the power of treating people with dignity. "This puck taught me something important," he would say to his students. "Strength is not proven by how cruelly you treat your enemies. Strength is proven by how much humanity you can afford while still defeating them. The Canadians did not beat us just with bombs and tanks. They beat us with butter and blankets and kindness. They beat us by showing us that everything our leaders told us was a lie." Democracy did not make them weak. It made them so wealthy and so confident that they could play hockey with men who had tried to kill their brothers. That is real power. That is strength we never understood. The lesson stayed with his students. Some of them became leaders in the new West Germany, helping build a democratic nation from the ruins of the Third Reich. They remembered their teacher's hockey puck and what it represented. The real shock was not the games or the food or the kindness itself. The real shock was realizing that the civilization you were told was weak, and dying could afford to feed its prisoners better than your own empire fed its soldiers. That was when you knew the war had been lost before it even began. You were just waiting for everyone else to realize it too,